Picture this. It's 1989. The Soviet Union, it's this massive superpower, right? But it's teetering on the edge. Its economy, this rigid top-down command structure that had been in place for over 70 years, was starting to show some serious cracks. Today, we're going to look at the desperate last-ditch effort to save it, as it was happening.
All right, so let's get right into it. What makes this so fascinating is that the document we're looking at is basically a time capsule. This paper was written in the summer of 1989, so we get a real-time analysis of the Soviet reform movement, Perestroika, but without any of the hindsight that we have today. This is history as it was actually unfolding.
So, first things first, why was this reform even on the table? Well, by the late 1980s, the old-school Soviet system was, to put it mildly, failing. It just couldn't keep up with the West's technology, and maybe more importantly, it was struggling to provide the basics for its own people. The pressure cooker was on, and everybody knew something had to give. But to really get just how radical these reforms were, you've got to understand the system they were trying to change. And man, it was a monolith. For decades, the Soviet economy was built on one single core ideological principle. And it all came down to this one idea: classical socialist ownership. The theory was that the means of production, the factories, the farms, all the resources, belonged to everybody equally. So any kind of private ownership was seen as just wrong, something to be stamped out completely. I mean, it's a powerful idea, isn't it? A society where there's no private property, everything's shared. But the reality? Yeah, that was a whole different story.
We're not talking about the state owning some of the economy. No, we're talking about the state owning practically all of it. By 1937, the state controlled 99.8% of all industrial output. It was basically a total monopoly.
And here's the kicker, the thing you really have to understand. This wasn't a case of a big state sector existing alongside some small private businesses. Nope, there were no other legal businesses, period. If you tried to do anything outside the state's plan, you were forced underground into an illegal shadow economy. Total control was the only game in town.
And then, bam, Perestroika hits the scene. This was Gorbachev's wild attempt to just smash the state's monopoly, to inject some life into this dying system by experimenting with the one thing that had been totally forbidden for decades: ownership.
And boy, did they move fast. Just look at this timeline. It was this rapid-fire series of laws, one after the other, all trying to totally reshape the economic reality. In just 4 years, they made self-employment legal, gave state companies more freedom, allowed for co-ops, and even created a way to lease state property.
And these weren't just abstract laws, They had a huge impact on everyday life. All of a sudden, you could legally start a small business, a cooperative, to sell something people needed. State factories could make more of their own choices. You could even lease land. For the first time in generations, different ways of doing business were actually on the table.
This quote from Gorbachev himself, it just perfectly captures the insane ideological tightrope they were trying to walk. The official line was, okay, society still owns everything, but we're going to let other people manage it and be responsible for it. They were desperately trying to get the benefits of private enterprise without actually saying the word private.
But, and this is a huge but, this is where the whole grand experiment, all these new laws coming out of Moscow, just smashed head-on into the reality of decades of ingrained ideology and bureaucracy. And it got messy.
And this, right here, this gets to the absolute core of the problem. You'd have a progressive new law from Moscow encouraging, say, cooperatives. But then, down at the local level, the officials, the guys who controlled all the licenses and supplies, saw these new businesses as a threat, or worse, as a chance to get rich. So they'd slam them with insane taxes or demand bribes, basically strangling these new businesses in the cradle.
I mean, just stop and think about this for a second. It's wild. The central government cuts over 500,000 bureaucrats to try and reduce red tape. But at the same time, the local and regional bureaucracy actually grew by 700,000 people. The very system that was supposed to be implementing the reforms was fighting back and getting bigger.
And you know what? It wasn't just the bureaucrats pushing back. The public, they were deeply, deeply suspicious of all this. A poll from 1988 found that almost 40% of people thought these new businesses were just flat out unnecessary. Only a minority was actually in favor of them. So why was that?
And this quote from the paper we're looking at, man, it just nails the reason why. For 3 generations, Soviet citizens had been taught that making a profit was evil and that the most important thing was for everyone to be equal. So when they suddenly saw their neighbor start a co-op and make more money, the reaction wasn't, hey, good for them. It was what the author calls aggressive envy.
So at the end of the day, the whole system was just caught in its own trap, its own ideology. They were trying to create market-style businesses, but the leaders couldn't even bring themselves to use the word private. They'd call it individual labor-based property or some other crazy mouthful, anything to avoid that forbidden word.
So let's step back inside our 1989 time capsule for a minute. The system is at war with itself. The public is skeptical. So what were the actual results? Was any of this even working?
So what happened? Well, just look at these numbers. It's kind of stunning. Despite all that resistance, all the red tape, the corruption, the public distrust, this new cooperative sector just exploded. It went from about 350 million rubles in 1987 to 6 billion just 1 year later. Even in a totally broken system, it turns out that even a tiny bit of economic freedom goes a long, long way.
And this just puts everything into perspective. It really puts us right there on the knife's edge of history. The author is writing all this down, trying to make sense of these early, chaotic results in July of 1989. Just 4 months later, the Berlin Wall would come down, and the whole world would change faster than anyone could have possibly imagined. But in this exact moment, nobody knew what was coming next. And that just leaves us with this one final nagging question, doesn't it? The Soviet Union was trying to patch a market economy onto a command system, while being ideologically terrified of the very thing they were trying to create. It was a fundamental contradiction, right at its very core. And as we all know now, it was a contradiction that the system just couldn't survive.